Hello everyone, it's Professor Malone again, and we're going to continue on with Photo Basics Part 1, Understanding the Camera, Film, and Exposure. So last video we talked about the four components that come together to affect our exposure. The available light, the ISO or film that we choose to capture that light, the aperture that we set our lens to, and the shutter speed that we choose. All four of those things will come together and your final result will be an exposure. Whether that's a good or bad exposure will depend upon if you understand how all four of these things come together and how best to utilize your camera in capturing the available light. So what is ISO? Film and ISO. The ISO is a rating given to film that refers to the film's sensitivity to light. The numerical designation for the ISO works in the following way. The higher the ISO number, the more sensitive the film is to light. Films with ISO numbers above 200 are often called fast films because they can record images quickly and thus need less exposure to light in order to form a successful negative. Films that have low ISO numbers are referred to as slow films because they require longer exposure to light in order to record images accurately. The terminology of fast and slow films referring to the ISO explains why the ISO is often called film speed. Okay, so first and foremost, what does ISO stand for? If you look up ISO on the internet, you may or may not, come to this website, iso.org. And I actually found it quite interesting when first looking up ISO that it came to this because this is actually the International Organization for Standardization. Basically, it is a body of members from different countries who come together to set standards across many different fields for business. Ultimately, let's see, this is a good explanation right here. ISO international standards ensure that products and services are safe, reliable, and of good quality. If you go to Wikipedia, it gives you a little bit more background on the International Organization for Standardization. Founded in 1947, and basically it is comprised of 163 national members out of 206 total countries in the world. So how does this pertain to photography? If we come all the way down to products named after ISO, it says the fact that so many of the ISO created standards are ubiquitous or universal across the entire planet, that has led on occasion to common use of ISO to describe the actual product that conforms to a standard. Some examples of this are, and we'll skip over this first bullet point and come here, photographic film's sensitivity to light, its film speed, is described by ISO. So if you want to spend more time looking into this organization or, film speed, be my guest. But that is what ISO stands for. So when we talk about film speed, what are we talking about? Well, if you are using a roll of film, there's many numbers on the roll of film, but there'll be a number for amount of exposures, but then there's this other number, 400, 100. On this one, it looks like it says 3,200. On this particular roll here, it says 200. So what do those numbers mean? What those numbers mean is, like we've already covered, it's the film sensitivity to light. So first and foremost, if you're using a film camera, load your roll of film, and you're going to find the dial on your camera and make sure that the ISO is matching the film's ISO. If you're using a digital camera, you can bring up the ISO menu and you can, toggle through the different ISO numbers on a whim. The advantage to using digital is you can switch back and forth as much as you want. With film, you've got to stick with that ISO until you shoot all the exposures of your film. Well, you don't have to shoot all the exposures, but that would be a waste of film. So looking here, what does this mean? Okay, so the lower the number, the less sensitive it is to light. The higher the ISO number, the more sensitive it is to light. So what does this mean if it's sensitive or less sensitive? It basically means that a lower number will capture less light and a higher number will capture more light. Okay, so what does that mean? It means if you are taking a picture and it's coming out super dark, increase the ISO and it's going to brighten it up a little bit. Lower number, more light is needed for a good exposure. Higher number, less light is needed for good exposure. And then there's another thing here talking about noise or grain. Noise is something that happens with digital photography. Grain is something that happens with film photography. But the lower the ISO number, the less image noise or grain. The higher the number, the more image noise or grain. So let's look at that in some realistic terms. So I have this example already up. And first of all, I'm using Google Images for everything. So if you're ever stuck, you can't find my video or something, just, Google some of the terms and you can find a lot of this stuff. So, for example, what was I talking about with the less grain and stuff? If you look at these two images, this image was shot with 100 ISO. This was shot with 3200 ISO. If you look at the difference in the images, there is a smoother transition between tones in this image, whereas here you almost see like a modeled pixelization of the image, okay? And so for some situations, a smoother image is necessary. For others, not so much. So I like to say, if you're shooting a commercial image, advertising images, a fashion shoot, you want to use a lower ISO. You want a really smooth, clear image. Versus if you're outside maybe during the Ferguson riots at night and it's important for you to capture action quickly, and smooth transition isn't as important as capturing the action, then you're going to bring your camera to a higher ISO. So for photojournalism and things like that, the quality of the image doesn't matter so much as the subject of the image matters. Okay. Here's another example of ISO here, right? So here, it's the same setting. This photographer has shot each image at 1/10 of a second, so that's the shutter speed, which we haven't gotten to yet, and f-stop 2.8. F-stop and aperture can be used interchangeably. They're basically the same word. And if you look here, it's an f-stop of 2.8, and we haven't talked about aperture or f-stop yet. So don't worry if this and this mean absolutely nothing to you. You watch the future videos, they will make sense. But let's just say everything is staying the same with this image. The light is staying the same. The shutter speed is staying the same. The aperture is staying the same. The only thing that is changing is the ISO. So you notice on this first click, camera set at ISO 100, we've got a dark image. The photographer has raised the ISO to 400, and this isn't a bad exposure. It's really not. Raise it to ISO 800, it's an even better exposure. Raise it to 1600, and look at this. We've got great detail in the shadows. We've got great detail in the brights. It's an overall great exposure. There's no flash being used here. It's just the camera settings. So ultimately, if you're shooting and you feel like your images are way too bright or way too dark, play around with the ISO and, see where that brings you. ISO and digital capture. Many digital cameras allow us to choose an ISO rating. So this is where we come to, if you're using a camera other than an SLR, you may not be able to choose your ISO rating, but you may be able to choose like portrait mode or sports mode or like night mode or whatever. So those modes are ultimately you telling the camera what setting you're in, and the camera will choose ISO for you. The decision as to which ISO setting to choose should correspond to the quality of light available, the shutter/aperture relationship we want to use. So for example, if you know you're taking a still life image where no objects are moving at all, then your shutter speed really doesn't matter. Um, Aperture, we will discuss how that works in the next video. But if you're taking an image of something that's moving, you know that you're going to want a fast shutter speed. And sometimes with a fast shutter speed in a dimly lit situation, you're going to need to increase your ISO. Because obviously if your shutter's opening and closing very fast, not a lot of light is hitting either your film or your digital sensor. So you're going to need to compensate by raising or lowering the ISO. How we want the subject to be recorded. So as you take more and more pictures, you're going to start to realize the way the camera works, because the way our eyes see light is very different to the way the camera records light. So the more you shoot, the more you'll see what your camera's capabilities are. But you might want to take a picture where let's talk about taking a portrait, for example, and you've got this model. Maybe you want the model's whole face illuminated. Well, that might be a different ISO than if you want the model's face half in shadow. All right, and so the ISO, just switching that around, can drastically change how deep the shadows are versus how bright the brightest areas of the pictures are. Also, whether or not we want to mimic the grain structure of a particular film. So we talked about noise and grain before. As a matter of fact, let me go back really quickly just to these images and see if we can find something that's going to show grain in an image. Okay, so this is a good example. So once again, here is a lower ISO of 125. And for the most part, it's a good smooth transition. But when we get over here into 3200, we've got all these little dots in our shadow area up here in our negative space. And if you look, this is like a ruler or a measuring tape or something. Here it's very clear. When we get here, we almost can't tell what the numbers are because we're losing visual information because it's recording the light so fast that it doesn't have time to really record all the nuances of the light, which in certain situations is fine, other situations not so much. Okay, so after looking at this video, find where your ISO setting is in your camera and snap some pictures, keeping your shutter speed and aperture the same, and see what happens.